I want to ask you a question this morning. What is it that you would love to be remembered for? What is it that you would love to be remembered for? Like if your family gathered together and you could eavesdrop on your family and you heard them say all these things about you, what would you love to hear from them? And what would be the thing that you would hear from them that would make you say something like to yourself, you know, in spite of everything, my life was worth it. That my life, in spite of it all, was worth living. That it meant something. That it was worth it all. Just to hear what my family is saying about me makes it all worthwhile, and that I made a difference in someone else. What would you want to hear? How would you want to be remembered? You know, I heard somebody a long time ago, a mentor a long time ago, kind of use that picture for me. And they kind of said, you know, start at the end of your life and then live your life that way. What's so important to you? What would you want to be remembered for? And if that's such an important component of your life, then why don't you live every day in light of that? And I thought that was really powerful. I thought that was incredibly powerful because it forces us to think about the lives that we live, right? You know, for the last number of weeks, we've been doing a series of unlikely heroes. And we've been talking about these people in this category that we don't often use on people. You know, this idea of being a hero. And we've talked about unlikely heroes, people who weren't necessarily in that category, like they weren't the strongest, they weren't the fastest, they weren't the bravest, they weren't, you know, the ones that you would kind of say, oh, if anyone's going to jump to the challenge, if anyone's going to make a difference, if anybody's going to, you know, change the world per se, that's the person right there. In fact, in every one of these, you know, if you've been part of this series, in every one of these pictures, the person that became the hero was the most unlikely of people. That something in the moment that they stood for, that they believed, that they thought was so important, that they rose to the challenge the minute it became obvious, the minute it presented itself, and it made all the difference in the world. Okay? Now, we've been using a number of definitions for heroes, and I don't, you know, I want to put a couple of them up again. I know we've repeated it every series, but these are not your typical definitions of a hero, right? We all have somebody in our lives who's carrying a burden, right? No matter what I have in my life, I'm going to live to such a full degree that I'm not going to let it minimize what I do have. And we all know people like that. And they're inspiring. In fact, I know children in this category who we would never wish what they're enduring on anyone. And it's just inspiring to watch them manage it. You know, the other thing was an ordinary person whom God uses to extraordinary results. And many of the people in this series have done exactly that. They've been, you know, God's used them. They just basically said, you know, I may not be comfortable with this situation, but I'm going to rise up when everybody else has fallen to the side. I'm going to let God use me. I'm going to trust God in this moment. And incredible results happen because they allowed themselves to be used of God to an incredible degree. You know, if you go online and you Google hero, this next slide is the definition of what you're normally going to get. Is a person who makes a personal sacrifice for the sake and benefit of others. Now, to me, that's every parent. That's every grandparent. And bless you today if you're a grandparent, right? But how many of us have made personal sacrifice? But how many of us never get the label of hero attached to our lives? Although in many ways, when you look at the definitions, many of us, many of you, are heroic in the lives that you lead. And for some of us, that heroism is exactly what people remember the most about us when it becomes important. That crystallizes in your families or your friends' minds what it is that they valued the most about you. It's the thing that inspired them the most. It's the thing that they carried with them. It's the thing that made their lives better, even though it was difficult for you. You know, one of the great passages, we're going to look at just a few snippets in the Bible, is the book of 2 Timothy. Now, the book of 2 Timothy is written by the Apostle Paul, this great, messenger of God's word, who was one of the, was probably the greatest church planter, and took the mission and the gospel to the unknown, the world at that time, and wrote many letters to churches and started many churches. But 2 Timothy is really unique in many ways because it's the last book of his writing. And scholars believe that he was languishing in prison during the time of writing this book. And he was subsequently beheaded to the end of his life, obviously. But what's really striking about 2 Timothy is in most contexts, we use the book as pastors, ministers, priests to kind of pass on what's really important whenever somebody new is taken on a position or somebody's going into ministry. Because the Apostle Paul, at a time when he could have been bemoaning his situation, at a time when he could be writing about just how difficult his life had been, devotes 2 Timothy to downloading what was really important to the Apostle Paul to his disciple, a younger man named Timothy, who he was hoping would take everything that Paul had sort of begun in his ministry as he poured into the life of this young man and said to him, carry this with you. Here are the important things that I want you. I don't want what I started to end with me. It needs to continue. And here are the important things that I want you to take from here and to learn and carry forward. And I'm pouring into you. So this is a really important book, because if there's anything that the Apostle Paul wanted to be remembered for, was his faithfulness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what's really important about that is that he didn't want it to stop with him. If there's one thing about the Apostle Paul, in the church, when it comes to scholarship and when it comes to all of this kind of stuff, we love to treat the Apostle Paul as this great theologian, which he was. But if there's anything that was really prominent about the Apostle Paul, he had incredible pastoral heart. He had an incredible heart for people. He was an incredible leader of other leaders and would pour into young people and build in them something of a legacy for the future. In fact, I would argue that Paul, the way he poured into young leaders, is what helped propel the church in the book of Acts in many ways. In many ways. So let's look at a couple of passages out of 2 Timothy, and we'll make some comment as we go. Timothy, I thank God for you, the God I serve with a clear conscience, just as my ancestors did. Night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. I love the Jewish nature of that because in the Jewish world, day started in the dusk, in the night. So notice he says night first, then day. That's the progression of the days in the Jewish world, instead of saying day and night. Anyway, you don't care, I know. Just I thought it was a neat little, okay? I long to see you again, for I remember your tears as we parted, and I will be filled with joy when we are together again. Imagine, he's languishing in a prison. And in many of the Apostle Paul's years, he spent, as a Christian, the Apostle Paul spent more time in prison than out of prison. Did you know that? And what's interesting is that some of the times that he spent with prison was a little bit like house arrest. He had some freedoms. So, but in this particular case, he's really languishing. Like all the very worst of being in a Roman prison he is experiencing in this particular time. And you read this letter, and it's striking what he's trying to pour into the life of this young man. And he's looking back on their time together with fondness and everything. And this is what he goes on to say in the next passage. I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. Isn't it cool? It's Grandparent Day, and we get to read a passage like that, And I know that same faith continues strong in you. This is why I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift God gave you when I laid my hands on you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, of love, and of self-discipline, or a sound mind, as some older versions talk about. Now, all indications by this passage, just the way that Paul has written this, there's a tendency to think that Timothy is probably a bit of a shy guy. He's not, Paul is very much an A-class personality from everything we've done. He's very much in your face and all this kind of stuff. But it seems to everybody that studies this book that Timothy is a bit shy and reserved and maybe isn't as forward as he could be. And there's some things that are holding him back. For Devin, the spiritual gift of taking care of your kids in a way that disciples them to healthy relationship with God. That's amazing. We all are beneficiaries of someone who's fanned into the flames the gift that God has given them. We've all been beneficiaries of something of someone like that. In fact, we can look back, in the history of our lives, and I know personally, I can look back at the mentors, at the people that poured into me, and the people that helped me and shaped me for, what they believed God had gifted me with. And I'm so blessed to have that as part of my life, as part of the legacy that they left in me. And Paul is reminding Timothy that if God's given you this gift, then you need to put it into overdrive. That you need to, put fuel behind it and not to be afraid. Because if God's gifted you in this way, the expectation is he wants you to use it for his honor and for his glory. It's amazing what happens when a church is fully alive with the giftings that God has given them and the difference it makes to the world around us. If you believe your gift is this, or you believe, your gift is that, fan it into flames. Use it because it's for the benefit of so many other people. The gift is never for you. Can I say that? That's the thing. The gift is always for the benefit of others. And that's why God has given it to you. In fact, if you struggle with what your gift is, one of the best ways to do that is just ask the people closest to you. If you say, I'm really good with 3-year-olds, and your whole family says, no, you're not. Right? No, you're not. That's just the reality. But that's one of the easiest ways of knowing that. And I have this other belief about spiritual gifts, right? We talk about burning out. We talk about stress. We talk about all this kind of stuff. There's just something inside of me that says when you are fully working in the giftings that God has given you, sure, there are moments where it's going to get hard and all that stuff, but it's 10 times easier for you than it is for another person to do the same job who doesn't have the gifting of God. In fact, I can remember times where, I've been in rooms with leadership and the leadership says, oh, we need somebody to do a particular, who do we get to take this on? And I remember a number of times saying, can we just pray about it for a week as a leadership and then come back and we'll put the names up. Okay? I don't know how many times we've been in that scenario. You come back the next week, you've prayed about it, and we start saying, okay, everybody write their names down, and you kind of compare lists and they're identical. Right? You know what I like about the Bible, which is really, I find fascinating. How many times have you heard somebody say, you should just not fear? Take fear, remove it from your life, and just get on with it. Right? The Bible, do you realize the Bible rarely does that? At least the Apostle Paul rarely does that. Paul never leaves a vacuum. He may say, take away these bad things in your life. These are the sins of, or take away this kind of thing. Or God hasn't given us the Spirit. He always replaces it with something. God hasn't given us this fear and timidity, but what he has given us is power, love, and a sound mind. So instead of focusing on the fear element, the timidity element, the things that kind of stop you from moving forward with God, instead of focusing in those areas, focus on what it is that God has given you. Focus on the fact that you now have power. And it's not power to control people. It's not power, that you can lord it over others. It's the ability to manage what God has given you in the strength and the power that God has. It's allowing the Spirit of God to work in your life in such a way that God's power is manifested through you. I love the fact that he mentions love. There's nothing that demonstrates the power of God more than when you demonstrate the love of God exclusively. I've said many, many times that if you want to live the most courageous life, then love like Jesus loved. It is the most courageous and heroic way to live. Is it going to be easy? No, it's going to be extremely hard. But it will make all the difference in the world. In fact, we're going to expand on this next week in a big, big, big way. We're going to talk about this particular topic when we start into the We Are the Church series. And a sound mind and of self-discipline. This idea that we can live our lives in a way that's peaceful, that has integrity, that has faith in God in such a way that we can surrender all those things to him, the things that normally consume our minds, take away any healthy life. I have another passage that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy even earlier. And I love this passage, and this is good for some of you. Now, in this day and age, we celebrate youth. In that day and age, not so much. Okay? So you got to remember the context of this passage, because in this day, the elderly were the people who were celebrated, not the young. So notice what Apostle Paul says here. Don't let anyone, Timothy, think less of you because you are young. Be an example. Now, he could have stopped there just to be an example. Don't let people look down on you just because you're young. Here's doesn't leave the vacuum. Here's what he replaces it with. Okay? This is what he says. Instead of just don't say to people, I'm young, I'm a millennial, I'm entitled, I'm, all that kind of stuff that we get into nowadays, right? Which I'm not sure is even healthy in any way, shape, or form. Okay? If you're going to be a young person that's respected by others, this is how you live. And look at, be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. That's beautiful. You want to be an example? You want to demonstrate, the gospel in your life to the point that people are going to respect you, even though they may look down on you because of your age. When you live this way, no one's going to look down on you. In fact, they're going to say, you are mature beyond your what? Your years. Okay? Don't just become a statistical, reality for people. Be something different. Be something heroic. Okay, let me close out with these 4 really quick points, all right, as we close out this series. Number 1, heroes ground their lives in a greater purpose. Okay? You want to be remembered for something? Ground your life in a greater purpose. And of course, we've been looking at these biblical carriers. Ground your life in faith. Ground your life in the gospel. That's what the Apostle Paul did. The Apostle Paul is telling you, there is something greater to ground your life in than just, a white picket fence, a nice car, a nice house. There's greater things to ground your life in. And that's what the Apostle Paul passed on to Timothy. Number 2, stand courageous while others stand helpless. We saw in story after story so many people who could have risen, who could have, made a difference in the moment, but how many times was it one person who made the difference? We live at a time when it's all about the crowd. It's all about, the majority. And it's always been that historically. But why is it that it's always one person that initiates a huge movement that changes the world? Many of us sitting here today don't think that we can make any difference whatsoever. That's never been the case biblically. It's always one person who is willing to stand up for something greater, something more, more purposeful than what the crowd was running after, and made all the difference in the world. They said, I'll stand up for God. Everybody may be against it, but this is the right thing to do. What was that saying? For evil to win, it just takes good people to do nothing. Number 3, they project their lives beyond the here and now. None. Okay, here's the last thing. The legacy of a biblical hero is the memory of a great God and the inheritance of a great faith. And every one of these stories and every one of these biblical pictures that we've gone through, everybody's been able to say, look what God did. Look at the moment that they trusted God in the midst of the difficulty, in the potential, hazards that could have, followed them because of it. They trusted God. And after it was done and over, everybody was able to say, look what God did through the amazing faith of one person. I don't know about you, but I would like to be remembered in that way. For something much greater. To hopefully stand for something that didn't mean make a difference for just right now, but would make a difference for generations to come. I know it's kind of like pie in the sky, all of that kind of stuff. But if we're not willing to stand up, we're not willing to make a difference, if we're not willing to be heroic, at least with what God has given us, what chance does the rest of the world have? It only takes one of us to make a difference for somebody. And that's the beautiful thing about all of this, is that when God gets the glory and when we trust God, there's just something that happens that we could never have done on our own. Ever done on our own. That's a legacy. That's a beautiful picture of what God has demonstrated century after century after century, when people have stood up and been heroic when everyone else was running.